April 29, 1945, Sunday afternoon. Soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division reach the outskirts of Dachau. They expect a fortification. They find a graveyard on tracks. 39 sealed boxcars. 2,310 corpses. The numbers are precise. The reality is chaotic. One soldier pries a heavy wooden door. It slides back. Inside, bodies are stacked like firewood. Skeletal remains. Sunken eyes. Some have been dead for weeks. Others are still warm. These were prisoners from Buchenwald. They traveled for days in airtight containers without a drop of water. They starved. They suffocated. They became a cargo of bone and rot. It is the equivalent of an entire infantry regiment wiped out without a single shot fired. The smell hits first. A thick, sweet wave of decay. It rolls out of the cars and coats the lungs. Battle-hardened men who survived the hell of Sicily and Anzio stagger back. Veterans of southern France lean over the rails. They vomit. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks moves down the line. He counts the cost. The first car holds 50 bodies. The next holds 100. The stench defies description. Behind the barbed wire, 30,000 living skeletons watch the Americans arrive. 30,000. The industry of death that shattered Felix Sparks's soldiers in 1945 had been legally operating 10 miles from Munich since March 22, 1933. It began at a shuttered munitions factory. The steel gates of the old plant screeched open for a new kind of production. SS guards hammered the first stakes for the perimeter fences. How did a derelict factory become the blueprint for a continent-wide slaughterhouse? Through 12 years of methodical Nazi bureaucracy. Heinrich Himmler invited the press for the opening. He stood before the cameras and boasted of a facility built for 5,000 prisoners. That first night, 200 men arrived under heavy guard. Within weeks, the population hit the thousands. Dachau ceased to be a prison and became a laboratory. This was the model. The SS perfected the mechanics of terror and dehumanization here before exporting the Dachau system to Auschwitz and Belsen. The camp functioned for 144 months. It was a state-sanctioned engine of destruction, running 24 hours a day on the edge of a major city. The Nazis designed the site for 5,000 political opponents. By the end, the system had processed over 200,000 human beings. The main camp grew like a tumor. Nearly 100 subcamps spread across southern Germany. The bureaucracy transformed prisoners into raw material for slave labor in armament plants and construction. 12 years of continuous operation turned the factory floor into a graveyard. Official records confirm 41,500 dead. The actual toll remains unknown because the SS burned the registries to erase the evidence. Erasure of records failed to hide the core reality. Reports by Dr. Sigmund Roscher transformed Dachau from a political prison into a massive laboratory for human agony. The facility operated with clinical precision. Nazi doctors viewed prisoners as biological tissue, not human beings. Heinrich Himmler received the results directly. The data arrived in neat folders. Methodical, cold, scientific. Roscher focused on survival limits for the Luftwaffe. He forced prisoners into high-altitude pressure chambers to simulate pilot ejections. Lungs ruptured, brains swelled. He documented every second of the physiological collapse. Then came the freezing. Doctors submerged victims in tanks of ice water to study hypothermia. The water felt like liquid fire against the skin. Then, the numbing. Many stayed in the tanks for 3 hours. Most died when their body temperature hit 25 degrees Celsius. Other blocks became breeding grounds for disease. Doctors intentionally infected over 1,000 prisoners with malaria to test experimental vaccines. They forced others to drink only processed seawater for weeks to solve thirst issues at sea. The torture produced hundreds of deaths. Those who survived remained permanently crippled. Roscher finalized his observations, summarized the time of death for each submerged subject, and sent the documented results to Himmler. When American soldiers witnessed the frozen remains of 2,310 victims in the death train, military discipline vanished. The Geneva Convention died in those railcars. Shock turned to a localized, unstoppable radiation of rage. Was the execution of 50 guards a war crime? For soldiers standing over piles of emaciated corpses, the law yielded to pure fury. The reckoning began in small, private corners of the camp. 3 young Jewish inmates cornered a man in a nearby barn. He was the camp's most notorious sadist. To save his skin, he had traded his black uniform for the rough wool and dirt of a local peasant. The disguise failed. The survivors did not use weapons. They used their bare hands until he stopped moving. The violence scaled up. American troops lined the remaining SS guards against the walls of the coal yard. Between 35 and 50 men fell under machine gun fire. Some were killed instantly. Others were finished off by prisoners who had waited years for this single hour. The liberation had become a massacre. Historians still debate the verdict. The massacre was only the final act. 3 days before the first American soldier reached the gates, the architects of the system chose cowardice over duty. April 26, 1945. Munich is 10 miles away. Allied artillery shakes the horizon. In the commandant's office, the machinery of terror stops. SS Hauptsturmführer Martin Weiss did not wait for the end. He knew the cost of his signature on the death warrants. He fled. The engines of the High Command's convoys roared, cutting through the heavy silence of the camp. They vanished into the collapsing Reich. Weiss abandoned his post, leaving his subordinates to face the reckoning. Who remained to hold the perimeter? The garrison had shrunk to 560 men. Among them was Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker. He stayed behind with a fractured force. Guards from the internal disciplinary prison and units of Hungarian Waffen-SS. Those 560 men were the discarded remains of a dying empire. While their leaders hid in the mountains, these guards stood at the gates of a cemetery they had helped build. The command left the Hungarian Waffen-SS units to face the advancing Americans alone. While the SS guards watched the horizon for the Americans, a biological collapse consumed the camp from within. In early April 1945, the infrastructure of Dachau finally broke. What happens when 67,000 people are forced into a space built for 6,000? The system fails. Nature takes over. The barracks became human warehouses. Planks of wood served as beds. There were not enough bunks for the living. Prisoners slept in shifts. One man stood while another lay down. The air in the barracks was thick. It was a heavy, stagnant soup of unwashed skin, excrement, and the sweet rot of typhus. The smell sank into the wooden walls. It became permanent. The food supply vanished. A single cup of watery liquid. One thin slice of bread. That was the daily ration. Starvation opened the door for the lice. Typhus tore through the ranks. 15,000 prisoners lay shaking with fever. No doctors, no medicine, only the weight. The death toll hit a mechanical rhythm. 200 to 300 people died every single day. This meant the camp erased the population of a small town every month through disease alone. The crematorium stopped being a solution. The ovens could not keep pace with the harvest of the plague. Bodies began to stack like cordwood in the open air. Among the sick, a new terror took root. Rumors moved through the wards like the fever itself. The prisoners whispered that the SS would not leave witnesses. Every man expected a mass execution before the first American tank reached the gate. April 29, 1945. Near the gates of Dachau, American soldiers discovered 39 railway cars. This evidence became a detonator for a massive psychological collapse. The air near the tracks was dead. How did 2,000 corpses end up on these sidings? This was an evacuation train from Buchenwald, abandoned and left to rot. John Lee reached the first wagon. He gripped the heavy iron handle. The door slid back with a metallic screech. A wall of putrid, sweet stench hit him in the face. Inside, Bodies were fused into a single mass of gray skin and bone. It was impossible to count them. They were packed too tight. 2,000 dead in one abandoned train. The composition stretched for nearly half a kilometer. 39 sealed boxcars filled with the same horror. Clifford Barrett looked inside and saw skeletons still wearing striped rags. Some had flesh. Others were just teeth and sunken sockets. These men had fought for 500 days. They were veterans of the 45th Infantry Division. They had seen artillery shred squads and snipers pick off friends. But this was not combat. This was a factory of death. The soldiers stopped being liberators. They became witnesses to a systematic slaughter that broke their professional restraint. Strong men vomited into the gravel. Others shook with a silent, murderous fury. They looked into the cars and saw the final moments of the prisoners. Many lay there with their eyes still wide open. Dusty Thunderbird patches on the shoulders of the 45th Division. These men were not impressionable recruits. They were the ghosts of a division that had already burned out 3 times over. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks led the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment toward Munich. His scouts reported a concentration camp nearby. Sparks did not hesitate. He ordered his men to divert from their primary objective to investigate the site. The 42nd Rainbow Division and the 45th Thunderbird Division moved in from different flanks. They had spent over 500 consecutive days in relentless combat. Their casualty rates hit 75%. This meant for every 4 men who landed in Europe, only 1 reached the gates of Dachau alive. The veterans of the 157th had fought through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. They had seen cities turn to ash and fields carpeted with the dead. They believed they were hardened to any horror. They were wrong. At approximately 2 in the afternoon on April 29th, Sparks ordered his battalion to deploy and enter the perimeter. The horror in the railcars was only the final stage of a systematic liquidation engine. On April 26th, the SS High Command triggered the mechanism. Why did they drive 10,000 people on foot through Bavaria? The SS was panicked. They were erasing the evidence. They were moving the witnesses. The logic was simple. Move the prisoners toward the Alps or kill them on the way. 10,000 inmates from the subcamps formed into columns of 1,000. They marched south. SS guards flanked the lines. The mechanics of the march left no room for exhaustion. If a prisoner slowed down, the guard reached for his holster. A single pistol shot echoed across the Bavarian fields. Then another. The column didn't stop. They left the bodies in the ditches. Those who tried to break for the woods were hunted like animals. For days, the roads became a conveyor belt of death. By the time American units intercepted the columns, thousands were already dead. Back at the main camp, the gates remained shut. 30,000 prisoners waited inside the perimeter. 30,000 survivors. When the sight of thousands of survivors behind barbed wire met the gaze of the liberators, the thin line between justice and vengeance collapsed. The American guards stood still. They did not interfere. The social order of the camp dissolved in seconds. Prisoners surged toward the perimeter. Some scaled the high-tension wire. Others smashed through the gates. They were hunting. Venti Leneric and hundreds of others swarmed the SS guards who had failed to escape. Yesterday's victims beat their tormentors with shovels, while United States Army soldiers simply stood and watched. How does a man react to his own liberation? He kills. Leneric later testified that prisoners hoisted Americans onto their shoulders before turning their fury on the guards. They knocked the SS to the ground. They stomped them into the dirt. To the prisoners, this was a birthday. To the guards, it was an execution by the masses. The hunt extended beyond the walls. 3 young Jewish men approached an American chaplain with a report. They had found their most sadistic torturer. He was hiding in a nearby barn, disguised in peasant rags. They recognized his face. They did not use weapons. They beat the man to death with their bare hands. The lynching by former prisoners was a chaotic explosion of rage. But the actions of Lieutenant William Walsh were a cold, systematic execution. The line between liberator and executioner vanished in the mud of the coal yard. How does a United States officer turn into a professional hangman? He simply stands before 16 surrendering SS men after walking past the death train. The Americans reached the coal yard near the back entrance. 16 SS guards stood against the brick wall. Their hands were up. Lieutenant William Walsh, commander of Company 1, gave the order. A machine gun team set up the tripod. The metallic rattle of the American Browning's bolt locking into place echoed against the masonry. A short burst. 16 bodies slumped into the coal dust. Near the tracks, Walsh found 4 German soldiers inside a boxcar. They had already surrendered. Walsh drew his pistol and shot them all. Private Albert Pruitt then climbed into the car. He walked among the twitching bodies and fired again, finishing off the wounded. At Tower B, 17 more guards descended the internal ladder. They stepped onto the gravel with their arms raised. American rifles barked. 17 men died where they stood. By ignoring the Geneva Convention, the American liberators legally entered the status of war criminals. They were no longer just soldiers. They were participants in a documented massacre of prisoners of war. Walsh and his men had moved from the battlefield to the gallows. The official report later confirmed that 41 German prisoners were killed during the liberation of the camp. No American soldier faced punishment for the mass executions because General George Patton personally crushed the gears of justice. He did it with one stroke of a pen. How do you legalize an obvious war crime? You simply declare it a historical necessity. The investigation reached the desk of General Patch. He forwarded the thick file to Patton. Patton did not hesitate. He reviewed the evidence and issued a command. No charges, no trials. The case was dead. The decision was born from a physical memory. Weeks earlier, Patton stood in the Ohrdruf concentration camp. He saw the piles of bodies. He smelled the rot. The general turned away and vomited. That scent followed him into his office when he read the reports on Dachau. He knew what the SS guards had done. To Patton, their lives were worth less than the paper the report was printed on. Contrast this with the reality of military law. Over the course of the war, the United States executed 141 of its own soldiers for various crimes. Yet for the massacre at Dachau, not a single man stood before a tribunal. Colonel Charles Decker drafted the official memorandum to bury the bodies. He sat at his desk and chose his words carefully. He admitted the law was broken. The SS guards were shot without trial. This was a violation of international law. But Decker wrote that justice or equity did not demand a prosecution. The conditions at the camp served as a permanent excuse. One signature. The law was switched off. The memo stated that fixing individual responsibility was difficult and perhaps impossible. It was an institutional lie designed to protect the image of the liberators. This decision remained a heavy burden for the participants for over 50 years. The documents Patton destroyed did not simply disappear. For weeks, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker meticulously reconstructed the carnage. He sat in a quiet office, the silence broken only by the dry rustle of paper. On his desk lay the physical evidence of a massacre. 35 to 50 dead. That was the official count of SS guards executed on April 29, 1945. Some witnesses claimed hundreds. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who tried to stop the frenzy, insisted on 30. But the paper trail settled on a range of 35 to 50. Whitaker stared at the photographs. They showed men shot in the back and others beaten into unrecognizable pulp. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was the iron rule of modern warfare. It was the legal shield the United States demanded everyone else respect. In Dachau, American soldiers turned that shield into a firing squad. Whitaker began the interrogations in May. He recorded the mechanics of the killings. Some guards died by American bullets. Others died by the hands of prisoners using American-supplied weapons. The rage was a physical force. These guards had operated the gas chambers. They had overseen the medical experiments. Now, they were the evidence. By June 1945, the investigation was complete. Whitaker's report was a clinical indictment. It stated plainly that American soldiers had committed war crimes. They had murdered prisoners of war who had already surrendered. The law was clear. Courts-martial were mandatory. Whitaker closed the thick folder and handed the final report to General Alexander Patch. While Whitaker gathered his evidence, 3 young Jewish men in the camp courtyard executed their own form of justice. Legal codes do not survive a genocide. Where does the line between justice and murder vanish? In the mud of Dachau, that boundary ceased to exist. The 3 men found their most sadistic oppressor. They did not use weapons. They used their bare hands. You could hear the dull thud of fists against the black SS wool. Skin on bone. Impact after impact. These hands were skeletal, shaking from years of starvation, but they did not stop. For years, these men were subhuman. Now they held the monopoly on violence. International law calls this vigilante killing. The Geneva Convention of 1929 does not recognize the right to revenge. But for those who watched their families disappear into the ovens, the law was a ghost. Other prisoners joined in. They stomped SS guards into the dirt until the screaming stopped. They had been beaten, experimented on, and broken for years. Suddenly, the torturers were the ones pleading. The transition was absolute. Power shifted from the whip to the victim in a single afternoon. It was not a trial. It was simply revenge. The same psychological collapse that turned Dachau survivors into lynchants shattered the discipline of Lieutenant Colonel Sparks' own men. Professional soldiers became executioners in minutes. Years later, Sparks would speak of that day with visible reluctance. He was there. He tried to stop the slaughter, but the seasoned officer eventually confirmed the truth. American soldiers executed surrendered guards. How does a regular infantryman turn into a killer of prisoners? The average GI had months of combat drills and weapons training. He knew how to take a trench. He knew how to hold a line. But he had zero psychological preparation for industrial-scale genocide. The soldiers had just found the death train. They saw 39 wagons filled with 2,310 corpses. They saw living skeletons and smelled the stench of the crematorium. The rage simply overwhelmed their training. Sparks estimated between 30 and 50 SS guards died in those bursts of gunfire. Under military law, it was a crime. Sparks knew this. Yet he refused to condemn his subordinates. Historians remain divided on the nature of the act. Some argue the killings were an understandable human response to the sight of the Holocaust. Others maintain that a war crime is a crime regardless of the provocation. The massacre was not a planned military operation. It was a total breakdown of the chain of command. Men reached a psychological breaking point and snapped. These were not professional executions, but spontaneous killings committed in a state of temporary insanity. The 39 boxcars waiting on the tracks became the trigger for everything Sparks witnessed. Why did the law stop working? Because the rules of a normal society dissolve among thousands of starving people. The stench of typhus and decay hung over the station. It drifted from the wooden slats of the train cars. Inside, soldiers found 2,310 corpses. They were piled in 39 cattle cars. Some bodies were skeletal. Others were bloated by the sun. 30,000 prisoners remained alive behind the wire. Most were shadows. They did not operate under the rule of law. They operated under survival instinct and years of accumulated rage. For the men of the 45th Infantry Division, the moral compass simply shattered. The scale of the crime made any formal justice look pathetic. At the moment the gates opened, over 90% of the survivors suffered from advanced typhus.